Let's begin with a question that's been floating through the ages, like a lazy puff of smoke. When did people start smoking weed? Not in the modern sense, with rolling papers and playlists, but in the ancient, incense-swirled, ritual-rich way that only early humans could invent. Picture this. It's 10,000 years ago. You're a Neolithic farmer. Your biggest worries are saber-toothed cats, unpredictable weather, and whether your clay pot will explode in the fire again. You've just invented rope. Congrats. And you're growing a strange, leafy plant that's surprisingly good for making it. That plant? Hemp. And it's about to become your best friend. At first, cannabis was the multi-tool of the ancient world. Rope, cloth, oil, seeds. It was the Swiss Army knife of plants. But then, someone, maybe a bored shaman, maybe a curious goat, decided to burn it, and something magical happened. The air got interesting. The stars got brighter. The cave paintings started to look like they were moving. And thus, the ancient high was born. From that moment on, cannabis wasn't just a crop. It was a companion, a spiritual guide, a sleepy time snack, and over the next few thousand years, it would travel across continents, cultures, and consciousnesses, sometimes revered, sometimes banned, but always lingering like a forgotten dream. This story isn't about rebellion. It's about relaxation. It's not about controversy. It's about curiosity. And it's definitely not about rushing. So, take a deep breath, let your shoulders drop, and prepare to float through the hazy corridors of history, one mellow chapter at a time. And before you drift off completely, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments from which ancient kingdom you're watching. Babylon? Atlantis? Your couch? I'm not judging. Just whisper it softly. I'll hear you. Let's rewind the clock to a time when humans were just figuring out how to stop chasing dinner and start growing it. The Neolithic period, roughly 10,000 years ago, was humanity's first big attempt at settling down. We built homes, planted crops, domesticated animals, and accidentally invented stress. And what better way to cope with the pressure of inventing civilization than with a little help from a leafy green friend, cannabis. At first, cannabis was the overachiever of the plant world. It gave us strong fibers for rope and cloth, nutritious seeds for food, and oil for lamps. It was the kind of plant that made ancient farmers say, "Wow, this stuff does everything except tuck me in at night." But then, someone, maybe a curious herbalist or a bored goat, decided to burn it. And suddenly, cannabis had a new job. Bedtime assistant. Archaeological evidence suggests that hemp was cultivated in Taiwan as early as 8000 BCE. That's older than the wheel, older than writing, and definitely older than your favorite bedtime playlist. These early humans weren't tea-rolling joints. They were weaving baskets and possibly sipping cannabis-infused teas to soothe sore muscles and sleepy minds. In the mysterious era known as pre-pottery Neolithic B, 8800, 6500 BCE, cannabis may have been used not just for fiber, but for its psychoactive properties. Imagine a cave full of sleepy-eyed shamans passing around a primitive pipe carved from bone, whispering secrets to the stars. It wasn't a rave, it was a ritual, and it probably ended with everyone falling asleep under a mammoth skin blanket. Cannabis wasn't just a plant. It was a vibe, a gentle companion in the chaos of early human life. It helped us tie things together, literally and metaphorically. It soothed our aches, sparked our dreams, and maybe even inspired a few cave paintings that looked suspiciously like dancing bears. So next time you see a hemp rope or a sleepy herbal tea, remember, you're holding a piece of a prehistoric chill, the kind of chill that helped humanity survive saber-toothed stress and Neolithic nonsense. If you've ever wondered whether the gods get sleepy too, ancient India has an answer. Yes, and they sip bhang to unwind. Bhang is not just a drink, it's a sacred potion, a creamy, spicy, cannabis-infused concoction that's been part of Indian culture for thousands of years, made from crushed cannabis leaves, milk, sugar, and a dash of divine mystery. Bhang is traditionally consumed during festivals like Holi, where colors fly, laughter echoes, and everyone's just a little more relaxed than usual. But Bhang isn't just for parties, it's for prayer. In Hindu mythology, cannabis is said to be a gift from Lord Shiva, the cosmic yogi who dances between creation and destruction. Shiva isn't your typical god. He's barefoot, dreadlocked, and often found meditating on mountaintops with a serene smile that says, "I know the secrets of the universe, but I'm not in a rush to tell you." Legend has it that Shiva discovered cannabis growing from the ground after a heated argument with his family. He wandered off, lay beneath a leafy plant, and found peace in its shade. When he tasted it, he felt restored, blissful, and, let's be honest, probably a little sleepy. From that moment on, cannabis became his sacred herb, and bhang became the drink of the divine. Priests and devotees began preparing bhang in temples, offering it to Shiva and sipping it themselves to enter a state of spiritual calm. It wasn't about getting high. It was about getting closer to the divine, a gentle buzz to quiet the mind and open the soul. Even today, bhang is served during religious ceremonies, especially in northern India. It's not uncommon to see sleepy-eyed pilgrims sipping from clay cups, smiling at the sky, and whispering prayers that sound suspiciously like bedtime lullabies. Let's sail down the Nile, past the pyramids and palm trees, into a world of linen-wrapped royalty and sleepy-eyed scribes. Ancient Egypt wasn't just about gold and geometry. It was also about healing, dreaming, and maybe, just maybe, a little herbal help. Cannabis in Egypt, the evidence is hazy. Literally, while no one's found a pharaoh's bong yet, traces of cannabis pollen have been discovered in the tombs of mummies. That's right. Tucked between amulets and afterlife maps, there may have been a sprinkle of sleepy green. Why? Because ancient Egyptians were serious about medicine. Their doctors, called SWNW, wrote prescriptions on papyrus scrolls that included everything from honey to hippo fat, and nestled among these remedies, some scholars believe, was cannabis. The Ebers papyrus, dating back to around 1550 BCE, lists treatments for inflammation, pain, and even sadness of the uterus, which sounds like a very specific diagnosis, while the word cannabis isn't used directly. Some herbal mixtures described might have included it, especially those meant to soothe, sedate, or send you gently into a nap. And let's not forget the munchies. Ancient Egyptians loved their food: dates, figs, honey cakes, and if cannabis was part of their medicinal or spiritual rituals, it's not hard to imagine a sleepy priest sneaking an extra pastry after temple duty. But cannabis wasn't just for the living. If it was used in embalming or placed in tombs, it might have been intended to help the soul relax on its journey to the afterlife. Because let's be honest, eternity is a long time, and a little herbal chill might make the trip more pleasant. So, next time you see a pyramid or a hieroglyph. Remember, behind the grandeur was a civilization that valued rest, healing, and maybe a little herbal help to get through the day or the afterlife. Let's ride eastward across the wind-swept steppes, past galloping horses and golden goblets, into the smoky sanctuaries of the Scythians, ancient nomads who were equal parts fierce and fabulously foggy. The Scythians weren't your average warriors. They were mobile, mysterious, and deeply into herbal steam therapy. According to Herodotus, the Greek historian who loved a good gossip scroll, the Scythians had a ritual that would make any modern spa jealous. The cannabis hotbox. Here's how it worked. The Scythians would set up a felt tent, cozy, portable, and surprisingly airtight. Inside, they'd place red-hot stones and toss cannabis seeds and flowers onto them. The result? A thick, fragrant cloud that filled the tent like a sleepy genie. Herodotus wrote that the Scythians would shout for joy as the smoke enveloped them. Whether it was joy, spiritual ecstasy, or just a really good nap, we may never know. But one thing's clear. These warriors knew how to unwind. This wasn't just a party trick. It was a sacred ritual, a way to cleanse the body, calm the mind, and maybe commune with the ancestors. After a long day of horseback archery and gold looting, the Scythians would gather in their tents, breathe deeply, and let the cannabis vapor carry them into a trance-like state. It was part sauna, part ceremony, and part, let's see what happens if we breathe this in. Archaeologists have found burial mounds, called kurgans, containing cannabis seeds, ornate smoking equipment, and even golden bongs. Yes, really. These weren't just grave goods. They were spiritual tools, bedtime accessories for the eternal nap. The Scythians believed in the power of the plant, not just for relaxation, but for revelation. In the haze of the hotbox, they may have seen visions, received wisdom, or simply remembered where they left their horse. Let's stroll through the marble columns of ancient Greece, where the air smells of olive oil, ambition, and possibly a little herbal haze. Now, before we get too excited, no, we don't have a scroll that says Socrates smoked weed. But ancient Greek medicine and philosophy were deeply curious about plants, moods, and the mysteries of the mind. And cannabis? It was definitely on their radar. Greek physicians like Dioscorides and Galen wrote about cannabis in their medical texts. They didn't call it weed, of course. They used terms like cannabis and described it as useful for inflammation, earaches, and even calming wild horses, which, let's be honest, is a pretty niche use case. Whether they also used it to calm wild philosophers is still up for debate. Imagine a symposium, a gathering of thinkers, poets, and sleepy-eyed wine drinkers. The conversation flows from ethics to astronomy, and someone passes around a bowl of herbal incense. Was it cannabis? Maybe. Was it relaxing? Definitely. And did Plato suddenly start talking about the forms in a way that sounded suspiciously like a stoner trying to explain parallel universes? Absolutely. Cannabis may have been used more medicinally than recreationally in Greece, but the line between the two was often blurry. After all, what is a better way to ponder the nature of reality than with a little help from a plant that makes reality feel optional? Even Aristotle, the king of logic, might have appreciated the calming effects of cannabis, if only to take the edge off after a long day of categorizing everything in existence. And Epicurus, he was all about pleasure, tranquility, and avoiding pain. Sounds like someone who'd keep a stash of sleepy herbs in his toga pocket. So, while we can't say for sure that the great minds of Greece were lighting up, we can say they lived in a world where cannabis was known, respected, and possibly inhaled between philosophical debates and naps under fig trees. Let's march into ancient Rome, not with swords and sandals, but with sleepy eyes and herbal ointments. The Romans were known for their roads, their rhetoric, and their relentless ambition. But even the most powerful empire in history needed a little help winding down. Enter cannabis. Roman medicine was a mix of Greek wisdom, folk remedies, and a dash of try it and see what happens. Physicians like Galen and Pliny the Elder documented hundreds of plants used for healing, and cannabis, known as cannabis sativa, was among them. Pliny the Elder, who wrote the natural history, basically the Wikipedia of the ancient world, mentioned cannabis as useful for making rope and treating inflammation. He noted that the root, boiled in water, could ease joint pain and even help with burns. Not exactly a spa day, but close enough. Galen, the philosopher-physician who loved a good scroll and a long nap, may have prescribed cannabis for digestive issues and general malaise. And let's be honest, if you're wearing a toga all day, you probably have both. But cannabis wasn't just for the sick, it was for the stressed. Roman soldiers returning from battle, senators exhausted from arguing about aqueducts, and poets suffering from writer's block may have found relief in herbal mixtures that included cannabis. It wasn't about getting high, it was about getting balanced, or at least less cranky. There's even speculation that cannabis was used in Roman cooking. Imagine a sleepy banquet where the olives are infused, the wine is mellow, and the guests are too relaxed to remember which Caesar is in charge. Sounds dreamy, right? While cannabis never reached divine status in Rome like it did in India, it was respected as a useful, calming, and occasionally munchy-inducing plant. It was part of the Roman toolkit, alongside olive oil, gladiators, and dramatic speeches. So, next time you see a Roman column or a Latin phrase, remember, behind the grandeur was a civilization that knew how to treat a headache, and maybe how to take the edge off a Senate meeting. Let's dim the torchlight and step into the mist, because this chapter is about to get spiritual and just a little smoky. In the ancient world, cannabis wasn't just a crop, it was a bridge, a leafy ladder between the earthly and the ethereal. And the ones who climbed it first? Shamans, the original vibe, curators, the mystical middlemen, the sleep-deprived philosophers of the spirit realm. In ancient China, Taoist shamans believed cannabis could help them communicate with spirits, not the spooky kind, the wise, floaty kind who probably wore robes and spoke in metaphors. These mystics would burn cannabis in incense burners, letting the smoke curl around them like a sleepy dragon, and then drift into trance-like states. It wasn't about getting high, it was about getting higher, spiritually speaking. The Taoist texts mention cannabis as part of ritual mixtures, often combined with ginseng and other herbs. The goal? To quiet the mind, open the third eye, and maybe ask the universe a few sleepy questions like, why do stars twinkle? Or, is it bedtime yet? Meanwhile, in the frosty lands of Siberia, ancient tribes had their own smoky secrets. The Scythians, a nomadic people known for their horse riding, gold hoarding, and general badassery, used cannabis in steam baths. They'd toss the leaves onto hot stones inside felt tense, creating a cloud of herbal vapor that filled the room. It was part sauna, part ceremony, and part, let's see what happens if we breathe this in. Spoiler, what happened was usually a lot of deep thoughts and very slow blinking. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, wrote about these Scythian rituals around 440 BCE. He described how they would shout for joy as the smoke enveloped them, whether it was joy, spiritual ecstasy, or just a really good nap. We may never know. But one thing's clear. Cannabis was their gateway to something beyond the ordinary. These ancient cultures didn't see cannabis as a party drug. They saw it as a sacred tool, a way to connect with nature, the cosmos, and the sleepy wisdom that lives in all of us. It was medicine, magic, and meditation rolled into one leafy bundle. Let's wander into the warm breeze of the Middle East, where the stars shine like lanterns and the nights are long, thoughtful, and just a little hazy. Welcome to the Islamic Golden Age, a time of science, art, and hashish. Hashish, the concentrated resin of the cannabis plant, was the sleepy superstar of this era. Unlike raw cannabis, hashish was potent, portable, and perfect for pondering the mysteries of existence while reclining on embroidered cushions. It wasn't just a substance, it was a mood. By the 9th century, hashish had spread across the Islamic world, from Persia to Egypt to the Arabian Peninsula. It was used by mystics, scholars, and poets, especially the Sufis, who believed in reaching divine ecstasy through music, meditation, and occasionally a puff of something special. In Cairo, hashish dens became social salons. Picture this: a room filled with velvet pillows, flickering lanterns, and sleepy-eyed philosophers debating the nature of time while slowly melting into their seats. The air is thick with smoke and metaphors. Someone recites a poem about the moon. Someone else forgets what they were saying halfway through a sentence. It's perfect. Poets like Al-Ma'ari and others wrote verses that danced between satire and serenity, often referencing the dreamy effects of hashish. It was seen as a way to soften the edges of reality, to make the harshness of life a little more bearable, and to turn ordinary evenings into mystical journeys. Of course, not everyone was a fan. Some Islamic scholars frowned upon hashish, calling it a distraction from prayer and discipline, but others saw it as a tool for introspection, a way to quiet the mind and listen for the whispers of the divine. Hashish wasn't just smoked. It was eaten, infused, and shared. It became part of the cultural fabric woven into stories, rituals, and recipes. It was the dessert of the desert, the lullaby of the lounge, the incense of insight. So next time you see a crescent moon, or hear a line of poetry that makes you feel floaty, remember, you're channeling the spirit of desert dreamers who believed that sometimes the best way to understand the universe is to recline and exhale. Let's tiptoe into the candlelit corridors of medieval Europe, where monks brewed potions, herbalists whispered to plants, and cannabis quietly made its way into the healing arts, like a sleepy guest who never left. In the Middle Ages, medicine was a mix of faith, folklore, and whatever grew in the garden. Monasteries were the hospitals of the day, and monks were the pharmacists. They cultivated herbs for everything from headaches to heartbreak, and cannabis, known as hemp or cannabis, was one of their leafy allies. While the psychoactive side of cannabis wasn't front and center, its medicinal properties were well known. Medieval herbalists used it to treat inflammation, pain, and even melancholy, which was the old-timey word for I'm sad and don't know why. Sound familiar? The Hortus Sanitatis, a 15th century herbal encyclopedia, described cannabis as useful for quenching heat in the head. Translation: it helped people chill out, whether it was brewed into teas, mashed into poultices, or tucked into sleepy sachets. Cannabis was part of the medieval toolkit for healing body and soul. But it wasn't just about medicine. Mystics and alchemists believed that plants held spiritual energy. Cannabis, with its calming effects and curious aroma, may have been used in rituals to promote visions, dreams, and deep contemplation. Imagine a cloaked figure in a stone chamber, surrounded by flickering candles and scrolls, inhaling herbal smoke and scribbling notes about the nature of the universe, or just doodling stars. In folk traditions, cannabis was sometimes used to ward off evil spirits or invite good ones. It was burned in bundles, hung in doorways, and whispered to during moonlit rituals. Whether it worked or not is beside the point. It made people feel protected, connected, and just a little more relaxed. So next time you see a medieval tapestry or hear Gregorian chant, remember, behind the solemn faces and Latin prayers were people who believed in the healing power of plants and maybe took a puff before bedtime. Let's tiptoe into the candlelit studios and leafy gardens of the Renaissance, a time when humanity stretched, yawned, and said, let's get creative. The Middle Ages were fading, the printing press was humming, and cannabis was quietly making a comeback. During the Renaissance, Europe rediscovered ancient texts, explored new lands, and rekindled its love for herbal medicine. Cannabis, once tucked away in monastery gardens, began appearing in medical manuals, botanical illustrations, and the occasional apothecary's sleepy drawer. Physicians like John Gerard and Nicholas Culpeper wrote about hemp's healing properties. Gerard's Herbal, 1597, described cannabis as useful for treating inflammation and easing pain. Culpeper, ever the poetic herbalist, praised its ability to allay the humors and comfort the joints. Translation: it helped people chill out and stop creaking like old wooden chairs. But cannabis wasn't just for medicine. It was for inspiration. Artists, poets, and philosophers were diving deep into the mysteries of the human mind, and cannabis may have played a quiet role in their creative rituals. Imagine Leonardo da Vinci sketching flying machines with a cup of herbal tea beside him, or Michelangelo staring at a blank ceiling, wondering if a little puff might help him see angels. Explorers brought cannabis seeds across oceans, planting them in new lands and spreading the sleepy gospel. Hemp became a staple crop, used for sails, ropes, and paper. Some of the earliest printed books may have been made from hemp paper, meaning your favorite Renaissance sonnet might have been born on a cannabis leaf. How poetic is that? Even the thinkers of the time, Descartes, Galileo, and their curious crew, lived in a world where cannabis was known, respected, and occasionally brewed into bedtime tonics. Whether they used it to ponder the stars or just to sleep through the plague, we may never know. But the vibe, definitely mellow. So next time you see a Renaissance painting or hear a lute melody, remember, behind the genius was a world rediscovering the power of plants and maybe taking a gentle puff before painting the Sistine Chapel. Let's hoist the sails and drift into the age of exploration, where ships were stuffed with spices, maps, and, surprise, cannabis seeds. The colonial era wasn't just about conquest and cartography, it was also about crops. And cannabis, it hitched a ride on every major voyage. As European powers expanded across the globe, they brought with them their favorite plants: tobacco, sugarcane, coffee, and hemp. Hemp was the workhorse of the colonial toolkit. It made ropes, sails, nets, and paper. Without hemp, the ships wouldn't sail, the letters wouldn't write, and the flags wouldn't flap. It was the unsung hero of empire. In the Americas, hemp was one of the first crops planted by settlers. George Washington grew it. Thomas Jefferson praised it. Colonial farmers cultivated acres of it, not for smoking, but for survival. Still, it's hard to imagine they didn't notice the plant's more relaxing properties. After all, long days of plowing and politicking call for a little herbal wind down. But as cannabis spread, so did confusion. Was it medicine? Was it mischief? Was it something you could tax? Colonial governments began to regulate its use, especially as hashish and other potent forms arrived from the East. What was once a humble fiber became a topic of debate, suspicion, and sleepy curiosity. Sailors, always on the lookout for something to take the edge off, may have used cannabis to relax during long voyages. Picture a hammock swinging gently in the lower deck, a sailor puffing on a pipe, staring at the stars and wondering if sea monsters get the munchies. In India, under British rule, cannabis was both embraced and controlled. The British documented its use in traditional medicine, even publishing reports on its effects. One famous study, the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission Report of 1894, concluded that moderate use was mostly harmless and occasionally helpful, a rare moment of colonial chill. Meanwhile, in Africa and the Caribbean, cannabis took root in local cultures, blending with indigenous traditions and becoming part of spiritual and social life. It was smoked, brewed, and shared, sometimes in secret, sometimes in celebration. So next time you see an old map or a colonial painting, remember, behind the powdered wigs and imperial ambitions were people who packed a little extra green in their cargo holds, not for profit, but for peace. Let's tiptoe into the parlor of the 19th century, where corsets were tight, manners were tighter, and cannabis was quietly steeping in the corner, like a rebellious guest at a very polite party. The Victorian era was a time of elegance, empire, and endless ailments. Everyone had something: nerves, vapors, melancholy, hysteria, or just a general sense of I need to lie down dramatically. And the solution? Cannabis, often in the form of tinctures, tonics, and teas. Pharmacies across Britain and America sold cannabis extracts for everything from insomnia to indigestion. It was marketed as Indian hemp and came in charming little bottles with labels that promised calm, clarity, and possibly a nap that lasted until Thursday. Doctors like Sir William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, who studied cannabis in India, brought its medicinal uses back to Europe. He praised its ability to relieve pain, reduce spasms, and soothe the soul. Victorian medicine was a mix of science and guesswork, and cannabis fit right in, effective, exotic, and just mysterious enough to be fashionable. But it wasn't just for the sick, it was for the stylish. Writers like Charles Baudelaire and Arthur Conan Doyle explored its effects, sometimes in smoky salons, where intellectuals gathered to sip absinthe, debate metaphysics, and occasionally forget what they were talking about mid-sentence. Imagine a Victorian lady reclining on a fainting couch, sipping cannabis tea while reading poetry and wondering if the wallpaper is breathing, or a gentleman in a velvet smoking jacket, puffing thoughtfully and declaring, "I do believe the universe is made of marmalade." Cannabis was part of the cultural fabric, woven into literature, medicine, and the occasional scandal. It was legal, accessible, and considered a respectable way to unwind, until, of course, the winds of prohibition began to blow. But that's a story for another chapter. So next time you see a lace doily or hear a string quartet, remember, behind the prim exterior was a world of herbal experimentation, dreamy evenings, and sleepy sighs. Let's slide into the 1920s and 30s, where the music was hot, the slang was cooler, and cannabis was the unofficial guest at every after-hours jam session. Welcome to the Jazz Age, a time when joints met jazz, and the rhythm of rebellion was rolled in paper. In smoky speakeasies and neon-lit clubs, jazz musicians found more than just musical inspiration. They found cannabis, known by many names: reefer, tea, Mary Jane, muggles. It became the herb of choice for artists seeking flow, freedom, and a little fuzz around the edges of reality. Louis Armstrong, the trumpet king himself, was famously fond of cannabis. He called it the gauge and credited it with helping him relax, focus, and play with soul. For many jazz musicians, cannabis wasn't a vice. It was a vibe, a way to sync with the music, stretch the mind, and melt into the melody. The culture around cannabis grew its own language. Vipers were those who smoked. Blowing your top meant getting high. Tea pads were cozy apartments where people gathered to puff, play records, and talk about life, love, and the latest sax solo. It was a world of rhythm, rebellion, and relaxation. But not everyone was tapping their foot. The 1930s saw the rise of anti-cannabis propaganda, most famously the film Reefer Madness, which warned that a single puff could lead to jazz, dancing, and gasp, thinking for yourself. The government began cracking down, and cannabis went from cultural muse to misunderstood menace. Still, the Jazz Age planted seeds that would grow for decades. Cannabis became a symbol of artistic freedom, counterculture, and the right to chill. It was passed from hand to hand, note to note, generation to generation, always with a wink and a groove. So next time you hear a saxophone solo, or see a vintage poster with a trumpet and a cloud of smoke, remember, behind the music was a movement, a mellow, melodic, and magnificently sleepy revolution. Let's dim the lights and cue the dramatic music, because this chapter takes a sharp turn. From mellow to melodrama. Welcome to the early 20th century, when cannabis went from jazz club darling to public enemy number one. The 1930s were a time of big band music, big government, and even bigger misunderstandings. Cannabis, once a sleepy staple of medicine cabinets and music scenes, suddenly found itself in the crosshairs of fear, politics, and propaganda. Enter Reefer Madness. This infamous 1936 film was meant to warn parents and teens about the dangers of marijuana. But instead of facts, it delivered a fever dream of wild-eyed teenagers, piano-induced hysteria, and dramatic declarations like, "Marijuana will destroy your mind." Spoiler, it didn't. But the damage was done. Fueled by sensational headlines and moral panic, governments began passing strict laws against cannabis. In the United States, the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 effectively criminalized the plant, making it harder to access and easier to demonize. Other countries followed suit, and cannabis went from medicine to menace in the blink of a bureaucratic eye. Why the sudden crackdown? Some say it was about control. Others point to racism, xenophobia, and economic interests. Cannabis was associated with marginalized communities, jazz musicians, Mexican immigrants, black artists, and that made it an easy target for fear-mongering. The chill was canceled, and the stigma was born. But even as laws tightened, the plant persisted. Underground cultures kept the flame alive, quietly growing, sharing, and remembering the mellow magic that had soothed humanity. For millennia, cannabis became a symbol of resistance, a whisper of freedom, and a sleepy protest against the noise of prohibition. So, next time you hear the phrase reefer madness, remember, it wasn't just a movie. It was a moment when fear tried to silence chill and failed. Let's drift into the tie-dyed haze of the 1960s, where the music was loud, the love was free, and cannabis was the unofficial sponsor of the revolution. This wasn't just a plant. It was a protest, a philosophy, and a very chill way to say, no thanks to the status quo. The counterculture movement was a swirling mix of anti-war sentiment, civil rights activism, environmental awareness, and spiritual exploration. And through it all, cannabis floated like a fragrant banner of resistance. It was smoked in parks, passed around at protests, and woven into the soundtrack of a generation. Bob Dylan sang about everybody must get stoned. The Beatles took magical mystery tours. Jimi Hendrix made his guitar cry while clouds of smoke curled around the stage. Cannabis wasn't just part of the scene. It was the scene, a symbol of freedom, creativity, and the right to nap under a tree without being judged. Communes and collectives embraced cannabis as part of their daily rhythm. It was used in meditation, art making, and long meandering conversations about the meaning of life and whether squirrels have souls. It helped people slow down, tune in, and drop out, just as Timothy Leary suggested. Though he was more of an LSD guy, the vibe was shared, but the government wasn't vibing. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 classified cannabis as a Schedule I drug alongside heroin and LSD, declaring it to have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. The war on drugs began, and the chill was officially under siege. Still, the counterculture held firm. Cannabis became a quiet rebellion, a leafy act of defiance. It was rolled into joints, baked into brownies, and whispered about in college dorms and desert festivals. It was the plant that said, "We're not angry. We're just very, very relaxed." So, next time you see a peace sign or hear a psychedelic guitar riff, remember, behind the flowers and fringe was a movement powered by dreams music and a little green leaf that helped people believe a better world was possible and maybe just a nap away. Let's step into the fluorescent lit halls of modern medicine, where cannabis, once outlawed and misunderstood, makes a quiet, confident return, not as a party favor, not as a protest symbol, but as a prescription. After decades of stigma and prohibition, the 1990s marked a turning point. Patients, doctors, and advocates began to speak up, pointing to cannabis's potential to ease pain, stimulate appetite, reduce seizures, and help people sleep, really sleep, not just accidentally nap on the couch sleep. In 1996, California became the first U.S. state to legalize medical marijuana. It was a landmark moment. Suddenly, cannabis wasn't just a counterculture icon. It was a clinical option. Other states followed, and soon, countries around the world began re-examining the plant with fresh eyes and open minds. Doctors began prescribing cannabis for conditions like chronic pain, multiple sclerosis, epilepsy, and chemotherapy-induced nausea. Researchers studied cannabinoids like THC and CBD, unlocking their therapeutic potential and discovering that the human body has an entire system, the endocannabinoid system, designed to interact with these compounds. Turns out, we were built to vibe. Medical marijuana dispensaries popped up, offering patients not just relief, but choice. Oils, tinctures, edibles, and yes, the classic flower. The goal wasn't to get high, it was to get better, to sleep through the night, to eat without pain, to live with dignity, and the public perception began to shift. Cannabis was no longer just a punchline, it was a lifeline. Veterans, cancer patients, and people with chronic conditions shared their stories, turning the tide of public opinion and policy. Of course, the journey wasn't smooth. Legal battles, regulatory hurdles, and lingering stigma still cloud the path, but the comeback is undeniable. Cannabis is reclaiming its ancient role as healer, helper, and bedtime buddy. So next time you see a prescription bottle or hear someone talk about CBD, remember, behind the science is a story, a long, leafy tale of a plant that waited patiently to be understood, and finally got its moment in the spotlight. Let's stroll into the present day, where cannabis is no longer just a whisper in the shadows. It's a headline, a ballot measure, and a bedtime conversation between lawmakers and mellow citizens. After decades of prohibition, the tide began to turn. The 21st century saw a wave of legalization efforts, driven by science, compassion, and a growing chorus of voices saying, maybe this plant isn't the villain we thought it was. In 2012, Colorado and Washington became the first U.S. states to legalize recreational cannabis. It was a historic moment. Dispensaries opened, tax revenue flowed, and sleepy smiles spread across the Rockies. Other states followed, and soon, countries like Canada, Uruguay, and Thailand joined the movement, each crafting their own version of legal chill. Legalization wasn't just about access, it was about justice. Activists pointed to decades of disproportionate arrests, especially in marginalized communities. Reform became a way to right old wrongs, expunge records, and build a more equitable future, one puff at a time. But the law is a slow-moving beast. Even as some regions embraced cannabis, others clung to outdated fears. The patchwork of policies created confusion. Legal here, banned there, tolerated somewhere in between. Travelers packed cautiously. Patients navigated bureaucracy. And lawmakers debated everything from dosage limits to zoning laws. Still, the momentum is undeniable. Public opinion has shifted. Medical research continues. And cannabis is no longer just a plant, it's a platform, a symbol of change, choice, and the right to relax without fear. So next time you see a news story about legalization or a politician talking about the green economy, remember, behind the headlines is a centuries-long journey. From ancient rituals to modern reform, cannabis has always been more than a substance. It's a story, and it's finally being told with clarity, compassion, and a little sleepy swagger. let's take a deep breath and look around. The world today is buzzing with dispensaries, debates, and designer strains. Cannabis is legal in more places than ever, studied in labs, sold in sleek packaging, and recommended by doctors. But beneath the polished surface, something ancient stirs. Modern cannabis culture, whether it's medical, recreational, spiritual, or sleepy, isn't just new. It's a revival, a remix, a leafy echo of rituals, remedies, and reverence that stretch back thousands of years. When someone lights a joint to ease anxiety, they're channeling the Taoist shamans of ancient China. When a patient takes CBD oil for pain, they're walking in the footsteps of Roman physicians. When a poet writes under the influence of hashish, they're whispering to the same muse that visited desert dreamers in the Islamic Golden Age. Even the language of cannabis today, words like chill, vibe, flow, feels like a modern translation of ancient intentions. To relax, to reflect, to reconnect. Science has given us new tools, cannabinoid profiles, terpene charts, and clinical trials. But the heart of cannabis culture remains deeply human. It's about comfort, curiosity, connection, and yes, sometimes just a really good nap. We've come full circle, from prehistoric rope to high-tech vape pens, from sacred rituals to sleepy playlists. Cannabis has survived empires, crusades, crackdowns, and cultural shifts. And through it all, it's remained what it always was, a plant with a purpose. So next time you take a puff, sip a tincture, or simply admire a leafy bud, remember, you re part of a story that began in the Neolithic and continues into the neon-lit now. A story of healing, dreaming, and the timeless human desire to feel just a little more at peace. Let's take one last slow breath and look back at the trail we've wandered. From Neolithic rope makers to jazz musicians, shamans to scientists, cannabis has been more than a plant. It's been a companion, a quiet presence in the background of human history, offering comfort, curiosity, and the occasional cosmic nap. We've seen it woven into baskets and burned in rituals, sipped by gods and studied by doctors, outlawed, praised, feared, and finally rediscovered. Through every age, cannabis has whispered the same message. Slow down, breathe. You're part of something ancient. Today, we live in a world where cannabis is being reimagined. It's in lotions, lattes, and legal briefs. It's helping patients sleep, artists dream, and communities heal. But beneath the branding and buzz, the soul of the plant remains unchanged. It's still the same leafy friend that curled around a Scythian steam bath, danced through a Sufi poem, and soothed a Victorian sigh. And maybe that's the real magic. Cannabis doesn't just help us sleep. It helps us remember that we've always needed rest, that healing takes time, that wisdom often arrives in a haze, not a headline. So as we close this story, let's honor the journey, the ancient highs, the sleepy lows, the quiet revolutions, and the final puff that says, we've come far. Let's rest now. Thank you for walking this path with me, for listening, laughing, and maybe yawning once or twice. Wherever you are, blanket fort, hammock, or moonlit balcony, I hope this tale brought you a little peace. And hey, if you're still awake, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments from which cozy corner of the cosmos you're watching. I'm not judging. Just whisper it softly. I'll hear you. Good night.